It would require part of British Telecom to be re-nationalised. Labour say the figure would be 20 billion. The chief executive of British Telecom has mocked that figure, putting it closer to 100 billion pounds. Do you want to see part of British Telecom go back into public ownership? And is it right for the state, for the government, to pay for people's internet access? Can't people pay for themselves? What do you think? 0345 6060 973. You text me on 84850. You email andrew@lbc.co.uk, or you tweet. You tweet at LBC. Let's go straight to two guests who've got entirely different views on this. Matthew Lesh is head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, and Grace Blakeley, an old friend of mine. She's an economist and commentator, of the author of Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialisation, and she writes a column, of course, in the New Statesman. Matthew Lesh, to you, I think you're not going to like this policy.
I think that this policy is a ridiculous, absurd election eve giveaway. It's quite clear to me, not only will this cost tens of billions, not only will it completely destroy any kind of competition we have in online broadband access, but also it's actually going to delay the rollout of broadband. There is literally billions being invested in trying to roll out new broadband networks in 5G. If the government tries to take it over, we're going to have years of delays through the courts, potentially contravening the European Union state aid rules in the process by nationalising the system. We're going to leave the whole broadband system in limbo, and we're all going to end up with a lower quality service in the end.
Grace Blakeley, there's a point there, isn't there? Because there is no doubt British Telecom would go to court to fight this proposal. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small shareholders who won't want their shares taken into public ownership at presumably below the market price.
Well, I think... Hi, Andrew, by the way. Nice to
talk to you.
Yeah. I think, BT's shareholders actually have quite a lot to worry about as it is. At the moment, BT is facing some pretty significant problems in its accounts. It's got a huge amount of debt, and it doesn't really look like it's generating enough revenue to be able to pay that debt off sustainably over the long term. At the same time, it's been dishing out huge payments to shareholders, which, again, don't look particularly sustainable. Some people have called this a kind of Carillion 2.0 model. So, clearly part of the reason that BT's facing these problems, part of the reason that many of these former nationalised companies end up with, such bad straits, is that they're operating with the kind of false idea of competition where it doesn't really exist. Things like broadband are an obvious natural monopoly. I think that's fairly obvious to anyone who's ever gone through the rigmarole of trying to change their providers to get an, inverted commas, better service, which ultimately all uses the same infrastructure. There's a very strong just basic economic case for this to be provided centrally by one provider. And, there's also a very strong kind of moral and political case to be doing this, which is that a lot of things that people need, whether that's, universal credit or just access to information, are all only accessible by the internet.
But if everybody gets it free, that means millionaires and billionaires, and there's been a lot of fuss about some Labour politicians saying we shouldn't have any billionaires in Britain. They'll get it free too, will they?
Well, of course, we won't have any billionaires left, so that'll be a bit of a moot point. But, no, the principle of universalism is really central to all of Labour's policy ideas here. The idea being that, often means testing things is actually just more expensive. It creates a lot of bureaucracy. And actually, the idea here is not just to kind of give away things to people that because they can't afford it. It's actually to say these pieces of infrastructure are ours as a nation. They belong to all of us. We should all be able to benefit from them, and we should all pay in to support their maintenance.
Matthew Lesh, what do you say to that?
So Grace says that the issue with the current broadband system is that there's not enough competition. So then the solution to that is to get rid of all competition to create a single monolithic broadband provider. It's just not true that we can't have competition. In fact, there's already substantial investments from Virgin, from City Fibre, from Fibre Nation that are ongoing in our broadband system. That would all immediately come to the end. In fact, TalkTalk today put their announcement in relation to Fibre Nation on hold. So we were going to get more competition. More competition is, in fact, on the way between broadband and 5G and other networks. We're going to see the end of that kind of investment straight away. Also, just this issue about making something free. First of all, nothing is free. Somebody has to pay for it as taxpayers. What we're really doing here is we're taking essential government money that should be spent on schools, on hospitals, on the police, and we're putting it to subsidise the internet of the rich who want faster internet. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's equitable. I don't even think that's a particularly good progressive policy.
Grace Blakeley's got a point, hasn't he? I read somewhere today there will be up to 600 private internet providers will be forced out of business here. And when John McDonnell was challenged about that, he said, well, we perhaps will have to nationalise the Virgin internet arm. I mean, that bill is going to get bigger and bigger. And really, what business has a government got to put good companies that are providing a good service out of business?
I think just coming back to that point about this money could be spent better, I think it's very funny to see consistently people who've advocated austerity and decades of cuts coming out and saying this money could be better spent on something else, when actually they don't want this money to be spent on something else. They don't want the money to be spent at all. And there are a lot of people who are coming out now in defence of the wealthy CEOs and various people who would potentially lose out as a result of this policy. And that's plainly because, the only reason that we had this privatisation in the first place is because there is a class of people who want to see benefits distributed out by the state to the wealthy. That's why we had privatisation in the first place, and it just simply hasn't worked. We've been waiting for this idea of more competition forever in this space. There are some things that are just natural monopolies. You can't have competition, just in the same way as if you were waiting for a bus.
Yeah, all right. So what about those 600 companies? They're going to be forced out of business. Are they going to be compensated? The state pays for the compensation? Are you really saying you're going to say to Sky you can no longer provide the internet? I mean, Sky provide my internet. My next door neighbour gets hers provided by Virgin. That's all going to stop because you think the government is going to be better at providing it?
Well, I don't know exactly what the plan is in terms of how these things are going to be nationalised. There's obviously a question about whether nationalising them, you have to pay market value, which is the value of the shares, or say book value, which is the value of the underlying assets that these companies hold. And of course, there's a very big question about whether or not we should be paying market value, given that they are artificially inflating their share prices by, paying out excessively large dividends that they can't afford. So many of these companies kind of aren't really working well in the first place. And I think particularly with BT, it won't be long before some of those problems, particularly problem around debt, will come back to haunt it. And, when it comes to this idea of, as I said, there being competition between these different firms, and we need all these different firms kind of all competing over just a single piece of infrastructure. Again, it just doesn't make any sense because there is just this one piece of infrastructure. Everyone needs it. It's all but impossible to be able to really live and survive in the modern world without accessing the internet. So why on earth are we giving it out to a bunch of different companies, all of whom are basically extracting tons of money from their ability to control this service and charge people huge amounts for it, when we could be providing it as a public good, which is what it is?
Matthew Lesh, to you.
Well, look, first of all, there is competition in the market. There are alternative providers who are providing other infrastructure. There can be multiple lines going along roads. That's in fact what Virgin has been doing for years now. But just on this point about the actual cost. So let me finish. Just on this point about the actual cost of nationalisation, we are at the point where Labor could be in government in 4 weeks from now. We need to know what their plan is when it comes to what will actually impact the shareholders, who tend to be pension funds that we're all invested in. It tends to be former employees. It tends to be unions who own these companies. Labor has no clear plans about how they're going to nationalise industry that's going to cost hundreds of billions of pounds, lead to less competition, more likely higher prices and worse quality services in the end. So we're living in a fantasy where we can just dismiss the details and say they don't matter. They do matter, and the lack of details shows a lack of thinking and shows where everything can go wrong.
All right, Matthew Lesh, final word to you, Grace Blakeley.
I would just say that the final point about pensions funds is actually quite a good one, because there are a lot of pensions funds that will be invested in these companies. As I said, many of them don't have a particularly sustainable business model, and they could end up having big losses. Lots of pension funds at the moment are desperately seeking out government bonds to invest in because they're a safe asset that matches the liabilities that those funds have. So the government will be not just taking away an asset from those pension funds, but actually being able to provide other assets that these funds need, and which will be more sustainable, as well as providing a public good to the people who are invested in those pension funds and using the internet to manage them.
All right, that was Grace Blakeley. She's an author of the book Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. She also writes a column in the New Statesman. Matthew Lesh is head of research